what Chaucer presents us in terms of our own time is a choice to embrace the exuberance of life despite immense crises, or to contract. And what you see, and this is something that he is definitely taking up the mantle that Giovanni Boccaccio had handed on, that is, despite, above all, the great terror of the Black Death that broke out in Europe in the middle of the 14th century, calamitous. And I actually think the latest scholarship really has, even in England, half of the population dying. So it's unthinkable. We've had our own pandemic. We know the loss of life has been great, but this is on a different scale. And that, along with all the other just horrible things that were going on in the 14th century, the wars between these new nations of France and England that would lead to standing armies and a practice of warfare on an industrial scale eventually. And in the name of a modern invention, the nation state, which has a lot to recommend it, but also has a lot that we would want to criticize about it. And then, of course, we have the great crises of the church, of the Catholic Church. We have the Avignon papacy, and then as we get into Chaucer's time, we have the Great Schism. And that highlighted the corruption in the church, and that's the thing that's always with us, of course. The hardest pill to swallow about Christianity, of course, is the behavior of us Christians, and I'll speak for those of us who are. And that's a tragic thing that was there then, and the institutional corruption very much came to the fore in that century. Lay energy was gathering because of the shift in material bases, right, from a feudal system to much more mercantile. Even with the great blow dealt by the Black Death, the trend lines were preserved. And again, the latest scholarship, which I didn't quite get to for the introduction, serfdom actually was dealt a blow by the Black Death. So the shift of the agricultural economy, the way it had been arranged, was already going. The Black Death accelerated certain. Well, it made everything unsettled, and what was settled, of course, were the estates. Right, you have we've seen it before, the bellatores, the knightly class, the nobles, the ones whose social power was based on their ability to defend the common, supposedly. I mean, that's almost purely ideal. And then you have the second estate. So 5% of the population were the noble warriors. Next 5% were the oratores, the ones who prayed, the priests, and then the religious nuns. And then you have 90% that were the third estate, the laboratores, the workers. And so the estate's model was very rigid, and it couldn't survive, as Marx famously lays out at Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. I mean, that when the material bases of production shift, the social order had to change, and it was changing. So that was a product of the High Middle Ages, with the explosion of population and the re-urbanization of Europe. And then the late Middle Ages is a time of how do those trend lines lead into modernity, right? And along with this immense crisis that happens in the 14th century, this multi-pronged crisis. And what Chaucer gives us is a poetic response to a time of chaos, but he reminds us of the amplitude of life. He shows us clerics and other religious operators who are not exemplary, very corrupt. He also shows us the simple parson who's a good servant of God. He clearly has he looks upon the human comedy with a profound sense of humor, of gentleness, of a kind of mercy. I mean, I feel that that's the kind of sensibility that's there. What I think of as a divine sensibility of a broad gentleness, tenderness. Of course, there are very ribald stories, all the way to very super idealistic stories like we have in the Franklin's Tale, and very intriguing ways of handling a very old legacy, right? But at this point, the courtly love tradition has become, it still has a lot of hold on the minds of the elite, certainly. And yet it becomes a hollowed out convention that gets played with. But what do we see, for instance, in the Franklin's Tale? What is Chaucer doing with those conventions? He's not simply, he doesn't just judge. He's not didactic at all, right? He's letting very profound counter arguments, as it were, counter voices, play themselves, or counter forces really play themselves out in the stories. And that's a very, that's what poetry should be able to do. So he starts the poem in the general prologue with the engendering power of March rains, right? And this coming to be of spring. And that is obviously being played off of to take a counterpoint in the 20th century with in the centenary of the poem that we've got this year, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, right? April is the cruelest month. That another reaction to a great crisis, that the First World War. Are we in a position now, a century after that terrible disaster and the Spanish flu then, and all that's happened since, right? Can we say after the Holocaust, after Rwanda, after, I mean, the catalog goes on and on. Can we say yes to life? Does that mean anything? Is that something that's simply, I mean, what are we saying yes to? When you see someone who's exuberant, do we think that's great but delusional? Do we think that is something that you would want to pursue in your own life, right? To the joie de vivre, you've got this sense of the potencies and the potentialities of human existence and time, which has, as we must admit, great sorrow, inextricable from it. Despite how painful existence can be, do we want to say from deep down, yes? And that's what I think Chaucer does so beautifully.